utilizing more Facebook and more Twitter. Sign up for our accounts if you haven't. But I think the most valuable thing is still picking up the phone or talking to people face to face. Talk to the source. You know, there are so many people that are having misinterpretations or misinformations that are just out there. And when you read it 7 times, sometimes it becomes the truth that you live in. So to me, that's not a very good way to communicate. Call, write emails, face to face. This is also why I started doing the monthly walk and talk with the mayor, so we can have this face to face dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Malozzi?
So I think that the communication from the city council out to the residents is a multi-pronged approach, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So after Measure D failed, we had engaged the Davenport Institute, which is the public policy arm of Pepperdine University, wanted to, actually we were an interesting test case, which I'm not sure you wanted to be an interesting test case, but they thought that we were a city that could use help with its communication. So for example, if you want public input on an issue, so I think when it's budget season and we're trying to figure out how to allocate our precious dollars, you need a town hall type forum so that people can come and give input. I think social media, is only really good if you're trying to have an outward message. So I need to tell you something and here it is. I also think the city website and newsletters need to be better, more dynamic ways of, it is another way of informing, but I think those could be much better tools.
Okay, Mr. Kemp?
So all the above is cumulative. Let me add to it. I think Facebook Live would be tremendous. I think that when you think of social media, you think, oh, young demographic only. But I think Facebook is actually starting to mix those demographics, and that an older population is starting to pay attention and to use that, whereas our kids look at us and they say, Facebook, you're crazy, I'm not using that. So that means it's working to me. So that's a wonderful one. Town halls are so important, and I don't see enough of them. And another to add is I'm frequently attending city council meetings as a member of the public today, and I tend to see the same faces over and over again. I think we need to actually encourage people to come because they're frustrated and they're seeing things in social media, et cetera, and they're not participating. So I'd love to actually see them here.
Okay, Ms. King.
I think this is something the City Council can definitely improve on. I think we need to ask the questions when we're trying to communicate with our residents. Who are we trying to communicate with, and what's the purpose of the communication? The who in our city is very different. We have residents that consume information in many different ways. So I think we need to use a variety of sources. We need to use the newspaper, our newsletter, some types of social media, the social media that's coming from our city, emails. Some people have told me they would like more text, so we can do that lots of different ways. We also have engaged the Davenport, not just for Measure D, but to improve our citizen engagement and communication. And so the whys are, are we just trying to inform residents? Do we want to consult with residents, or do we want to collaborate with them? And so depending on the purpose of the communication, there are many different forums that we can use in terms of focus groups or town hall meetings or one-on-one conversations, depending on the purpose of the communication.
Thank you. Okay, I've got it right now. Mr. McCarthy, right? Okay. Going back to some city issues, some complain that PVE codes are not enforced in regard to landscaping, weeds, home maintenance, unfinished construction, etc. Others feel the city is too strict about code enforcement and that their property rights are being infringed upon. What is your take? Is the current level of code enforcement appropriate, or do we need stricter or looser code enforcement? Mr. McCarthy.
The city has limited resources with respect to code enforcement, and I can just see that on the Traffic Safety Committee. In the Traffic Safety Committee, we get complaints about speed. They want speed bumps. They want stop signs. They want crosswalks. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to money. There's only so much you can do. So I think the Parklands Committee needs to work with the City Council and see if we can come out and kind of prioritize what some of the bigger issues are and focus resources towards that.
Okay, Ms. Peterson.
I agree with Kevin. We only have a part-time code enforcement officer as of right now. And there are a lot of things that we can, even though we have policies that we need to enforce, we don't have the manpower to get there. So it's utilizing the resources and finding out the priorities and actually going back to council to see if there's anything that, if we're just not enforcing it, why are we actually, keeping that as part of our policy? And on top of that, I think as the demand grows, we might need to appropriate some more money and maybe get a full-time code enforcement officer. It really depends on what the priority of the council is and the priority of our community as well.
Okay, Ms. Lozey?
It seems to me on this, I understand that we have a part-time code enforcement officer, but for me, the issue is just consistency and fairness. And my observation is if you know how to work the system, you get away with a little bit and you kind of maybe get a little more than what's fair to everybody else. So I think it has to be fair. And I think maybe we do have to apply more resources. I can't say if this part-time code enforcement officer is very busy or not busy at all. So I'd have to have an observation on that. But to me, if we have a rule that's, no enforcement in the parklands, then the rule is no enforcement in the parkland. It's not for some people and not for others, and this one's okay because it's not really bothering anybody, but that one's not okay. So I have an issue with that, and I think all the rules have to be applied uniformly, consistently, and fairly across all our residents.
Mr. Camps?
I hear a lot of frustration from residents on this, in particular around trees and cutting and controlling. I heard a story from a resident that had been actually suing their neighbor, which is unbelievably sad, because the city would not actually come and enforce an ordinance. So I understand the financial challenges, and I understand the part-time issues, but I think we need a greater focus on this. And so in direct answer to your question, I think it's a little bit too light.
Okay, Ms. King?
Our policy, which we've instructed for our code enforcement officer, is that there is a tiering or a priority of enforcement issues. So first is safety, second are encroachments, and then third are complaints from other residents. We had a full-time code enforcement officer before the failure of Measure D. I think at that point we had a very good equilibrium where she was able to have time to go out and find those areas that were unsafe and make that a real priority. She left, and we did not fill that position for quite some time. Very recently, within just the last couple of months, we now have a new part-time code enforcement officer, not a pensionable position. And we've given him the same instruction in terms of safety, access, resident complaints. I'm sure that there was also a backlog of resident complaints because we went over a year without a code enforcement officer. So he is trying to balance those priorities in enforcing, and I'm sure that we'll be working with him.
Mr. McGowan?
Yes, I'll just echo what they've all said with fairness and consistency of the application of the existing ordinances. I think that's mandatory. But as we've already identified, we were operating without a code enforcement officer for a number of months. We do now have a part-time one. It becomes an issue of prioritization and dollarization. And where do we want to put our investments? And those are all decisions that we need the input from the public to help us balance those types of priorities.
Thank you. Ms. Peterson, the next question somewhat relates to this. To save money, do you think City Hall should be staffed with as many contractors as possible and the minimal number of directly employed city employees?
There are certain positions that actually can be contracted out, and there are certain that cannot. So I think there's a balance of what we can actually legally do and what we cannot. And I understand that, people are saying if we have a lot of higher ends, then they're purseable, which I understand it's a big concern of ours. But we are utilizing part-timers that are not purseable to offset our unfunded liabilities. So I think that's something that's to be considered. I know that when you contract out, there's less control that we have. So that needs to be considered as well. I don't think it's a very easy question to blanket answer.
Thank you. Ms. Lozey?
I do agree with that statement or the premise of the question. I do think that we need, and this is the name of the game in city operations these days, in California at least, and that is having as few part-time or few full-time employees who are collecting full benefits and to contract as many workers as you can. I think the challenge we have is over the last 5 years or so, we've brought a lot of positions as full-time employees that previously had been contract workers, and it's going to be hard to undo that. And I think that was a mistake over the last 5 years, but we do have to have an eye toward how to undo that, because we have to going forward.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kemps?
Here's the real numbers. Between 2013 and 17, we've hired 8 employees. We've increased our headcount to 63. Our base compensation increased just shy of $1 million. And all of it is subject to pension costs. In conjunction with that, the other things we haven't addressed are our workers' comp costs. In that period went up 76%. And then in 2018, we kept going. So, yeah, I do think we're going the wrong direction. I don't want to be all negative. I want to acknowledge that, some things have to be managed and controlled. But I think in this scenario where we are all faced with such great pension challenges that we have no choice to do this, but then to manage it effectively.
Okay, thank you. Ms. King?
We have a balance of employees and contractors in City Hall right now. Our building and planning department is pretty much all contractors. We did have a situation several years ago where we had contractors who were supervising employees, which it turns out is against the labor laws. So yes, we had to shift some of those employees, some of those positions to employee positions versus contractor positions. I do think it's advisable to use contractors where it's lawful and where it's clear that it's in the city's best interest. For example, we used to have a contract engineer. We had, when I first came on the council, a lot of people, some of whom who are in the room, lobbied for a city engineer who would be solely responsible to us. And we did hire a city engineer. He's actually now the head of our building and planning department. And he, in fact, has proven to be a great asset to the city. He's gotten grants from us. He has looked out for our best interests. He has completed more projects than a contractor ever could have.
Okay, Mr. McGowan?
Well, I'll just add to what everyone's been saying about outsourcing, which is a term I use, whether it be a consultant or other sharing the facilities or personnel with other areas, is only going to help us reduce our pension liabilities in the prospective future. And that is something I think we really have to take a serious look at. It also might be getting back to how we do our business. Operational analysis is something I think that really needs to be looked at throughout the whole city, and making sure that we are using the state-of-the-art techniques, technology, and outsourcing services where possible to ensure that we are achieving our results at the lowest cost possible.
Mr. McCarthy?
I'm an advocate for contracting out when appropriate. Obviously, you can't do it for all like law enforcement or public safety, that you can't contract individual people out, although you could contract an agency. I'm also not just people, I mean equipment. There's no reason we can't lease copy machines or vehicles for certain positions. So both in the police department and in the police relief, we do a lot of professional services.
Okay, Ms. Losey, I think you're next. We have a number of questions about relating to Lunada Bay and Malaga Cove.
I'm sorry, I thought you'd missed her that time. Sorry.
No, I should have gone straight across. It would have been easier. But anyway, the question asks, what is your position on the Beautify Lunada Bay project?
Well, my position is that we need to have resident input and a wide array of resident input, not maybe just a few people that live around. A lot of people want it, a lot of people don't. So that to me is an example where we've got to have the input, and we have to create a forum for people to, to come together and decide what's optimal. Some people, there's obviously different definitions for people on what natural state means and natural plantings, and so something that causes such a high profile in the community, I just think it's critical that we get a very wide base of resident input, not just people who live in that area of Lunada Bay, but the whole city, because people from all over the city come down to those bluffs to enjoy.
Mr. Kemps?
I think when this was first looked at, I think the decisions were made too quickly. And I myself am sort of a naturalist, and I'd prefer to keep the cliffs and leave things alone. But it's not up to me. It's up to our residents. And so my preference would be to pull everyone together and to understand what they wanted. My concern is that if we do things like change paths, then maybe there's requirements for irrigation that could destroy cliffs. Maybe there's requirements for fencing that come upon us. So I really like the natural state of where we are, and that's part of the reason I live here. So my preference is not to make those changes.
Ms. King.
There were a couple of phases to the Beautify Lunada Bay project, and this is a project that's sponsored by residents. It was over a period of years, and they came for hearings in front of the Parklands Committee and in front of the City Council. I did support the first phase around Paseo Lunado. I did think that that was an improvement, and I do think that there was a lot of public involvement in that project. There was likewise a lot of public involvement in the second phase, which proposed that the plantings extend along the bluffs. I personally had a little bit of a different opinion on that. I think there was a different balance when you start landscaping the bluffs, and I wasn't all that supportive of the project. But it did come to the Parklands Committee, and that's as it should have been, so that there could be a public hearing. And the Parklands Committee heard our residents, as they should. Democracy worked. The Beautify Lunada Bay group has gone back to the drawing board, and I think they're going to have a much more modest project, if a project at all. So I think the process worked.
Okay, Mr. McGowan.
Well, I first of all would like to applaud the Lunada Bay Association for, I think what they've done up there has been phenomenal improvement to the area. Now, as far as the extension of the project, I know that there's pros and cons in the neighborhood. I happen to believe that if you look at just extending that existing plantings down along Paseo del Mar and not Paseo, but Paseo Lunado, and not onto the cliffs, that's my understanding as far as they want to take it. I think trying to extend it onto the cliffs is a whole different issue, and I think it cannot be used as a cookie cutter that could be applied to other areas of the city. I think each area needs to be looked at individually, and with the residents and with the irrigation issues or safety issues or any other concerns that the residents have.
Mr. McCarthy.
So during my meet and greets, I probably had about a half a dozen people come up to me and talk about specifically that, want to know what my position was. And I really didn't know a lot about it, but the citizens' concerns were twofold. One was the cost. It's citizen funded initially, but eventually the city was going to take that on. And with the problems fiscally, they were concerned about, okay, is that going to fall back on us? And the second thing was the shrubbery, and was it going to be trimmed, and views. So the people that live down there have views right now. They don't want to lose their views. And I agree with Jennifer. The process, it went back to the Parklands Committee, and it appears the process is working.
Okay, Ms. Peterson.
So with our city facing financial limitations, I always will encourage public and private partnership. I think this is one of the cases where our community got together and figured that they wanted to improve their landscaping along the bluffs. So the community engagement part is very, very crucial. And as it has gone through the proper process, going through Parklands, coming up to the City Council, being approved for phase one, the second phase didn't pan out so well. But with that, I'm okay with it going back to Lunada Bay Homes Association, going back to the Beautify Lunada Bay Project Committee to improve on their project and to plan out something that the community can really support behind. So wait and see. I'm excited to see what phase two, the new improved phase two might be.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about Lunada Bay and Malaga Cove more specifically. PVE's housing element required by Los Angeles County allows landlords in the Malaga Cove Plaza to convert their properties to homeless shelters if they wish. This has not happened to date. How worried are you that plaza landlords will choose to convert their properties to homeless shelters in the future? Mr. Kemps.
I'm very concerned not only about Malaga Cove, but I'm actually going to transition and hit the ADU issue because I think they're similar and they're combined. I know that our state is concerned about, homelessness and wants higher density, and I understand and I'm sympathize with those concerns. But I think the reality is that we want to control, via our CC&Rs and our deed restrictions, our own lots, and we don't want those things forced upon us. So I think that we need to have a more collaborative effort between the Homes Association and the City Council, and that the City Council needs to support and acknowledge not only the existence of that Homes Association, but be more collaborative with that association to keep those controls in place.
Thank you. Ms. King.
The housing element is something that the state requires every city to do. And what it means is that in its codes, it needs to have zoning so that certain types of dwellings can be built. It's a way to address California's housing crisis. So there have to be areas where certain types of density can be built, where emergency shelters can be built. The housing element does not require the city to actually build these things. It doesn't require them to partner with a developer to build these things. It doesn't require anyone to build these things. It just means if a developer wanted to come in and put an emergency shelter in Malaga Cove, that one could. That seems highly unlikely. There are no other resources there. There's no way, the land is very expensive, so it is not going to happen. And the consequences of not complying with the housing element are shown in the recent lawsuit by the state against Huntington Beach, where Huntington Beach removed some of the density requirements from its housing element, and the state has sued, meaning that they will have to comply.
Mr. McGowan.
Yes, I'm concerned about the coordination between the Homes Association and the City Council in trying to manage these types of issues. We've got CC&Rs that are deed restricted covenants in all of our land, and I don't think we have explored to the degree that I'd like to see all the defenses that we may be able to have and still comply with the state law, because I think we are somewhat of a unique community given the fact that we do have these deed restrictions.
Mr. McGowan.
I'm McGowan. McCarthy.
Mr. McCarthy, I'm looking at you.
I know, I saw
Calling
that.
me, though.
Mr. McCarthy.
So if they moved a whole bunch of homeless, made shelters and moved the homeless in, that would help the parking problem in Malaga Cove. But I agree with Jennifer. The two big issues are cost and services. It's really expensive to rent down there, and services are nowhere near Palos Verdes. So I don't think that's going to be a possibility. I don't think.
Ms. Peterson.
There are certain state mandates we have to comply with. I mean, it would affect our funding if we don't, and like what Jennifer had mentioned, that the state is actually suing Huntington Beach, and there's no way the council wants to see us getting into another lawsuit, especially fighting somebody like the state who has so much more resources than we do. I'm not too worried about homeless shelters being developed in Malaga Cove just because it's owned by private residents. They are going to do what's beneficial for them, not so much for the homeless population. And as far as the AD is concerned, answering to Michael, these are other state mandates that we have to comply with. The city is trying to make it as restrictive as possible, working in conjunction with the Homes Association. So we have two watchdogs, basically, two watchdogs to make sure that our properties don't get developed as freely as the state would like. That's what the City Council has been doing, is protecting our right to own our property, to control our property.
Thank you. Ms. Losey?
So to answer the question, I'm probably not overly concerned about homeless shelters in Malaga Cove, kind of for the reasons people gave. But for this issue, this for me is where I am concerned is, just my observation over the last couple of years is yes, the state has mandates that cities are supposed to kind of make sure that they have their own municipal code to address. But I'm not convinced that we're getting the best advice and that we should as a city. And I sometimes observe that the city staff and perhaps the city attorney have gone bent over backwards to write a municipal code that the state of California would be very happy with, but is not necessarily in our best interest. And that's where I would probably push back and say, well, I think I'd like to see something less accommodating to the state and more with our residents in mind.